Welcome to the Spring 2013 Community Medical School Series. It's great to see a lot of faces that have been here for a while and some new faces. I'm Dr. Cindy Forehand. I'm a professor in the Department of Neurological Sciences and a past presenter a couple of times at this forum. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce you to Dr. Deborah Black. Dr. Black is a clinical assistant professor of neurological sciences at the University of Vermont and a neurologist at Central Vermont Medical Center in Berlin. She earned her medical degree at McGill and completed an internship in internal medicine at Montreal's Royal Victoria Hospital and a residency in neurology at the Montreal Neurological Institute. Dr. Black is board certified in neurology and in behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry. And she specializes in Alzheimer's disease, epilepsy, concussion, traumatic brain injury, dementia, psychiatric disorders. And I'd like to just kind of take a minute to tell you about what a behavioral neurologist is, because most of you probably don't know. So the World Health Organization defines neurologic disorders as physical diseases of the nervous system and psychiatric illnesses as disorders that manifest as abnormalities of thought, feeling, or behavior. As a basic neuroscientist and a non-clinician, I have never quite understood the difference. And there's debate about really whether there is a clear division. There's a practical difference. The types of analyses and the therapies used in treatment may be quite different, but the scientific underpinnings of diseases of the brain resulting in either type of disorder are not really different. So Dr. Black's specialty of behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry is at the convergence between these two disciplines. Behavioral neurologists focus on clinical and pathological aspects of neural processes associated with mental activity, cognitive functions, emotional states, and social behavior. Every year, I ask Dr. Black to lecture in the first-year medical neuroscience course that I direct. She teaches us about the frontal lobes, a topic that the medical students and the graduate students in the course both appreciate, and I trust you will too. So tonight, here is Dr. Black to discuss top of mind, the brain's frontal lobes and their role in memory. Dr. Black.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's always very good for me to remind myself exactly what a behavioral neurologist is. I have my patients asking me all the time. I see folks who think I'm a psychiatrist, folks who think I'm just a neurologist, but really, as Dr. Forehand said, I do live at the interface of behavior and brain, and my job is to try to figure out what brain processes are involved in behavioral disorders. And we're going to talk tonight about a big part of the brain, and that is the frontal lobes, which are involved in a whole range of behavioral aspects, both normal and abnormal. I'm going to start by playing you a little song. So this is Chumbawamba, and I have my husband to thank for the sound. The lyrics say, "Do you suffer from long-term memory loss? I can't remember." So we're going to talk about memory tonight and the role of the frontal lobes, particularly in memory functions. I would just like to pause for a very brief moment and say that as long as we're talking about memory, just a brief note of dedication to the victims of the Boston Marathon, which I know we're going to remember collectively for a very long time. So I would like all of you who have paper and pens, paper and pencils, to get them out, because we're going to do some little memory quizzes here so that you can experience some of your own frontal lobes in some memory tasks. Just keep them out for a moment. We'll get there. I'm going to talk about how our frontal lobes are similar to our closest cousins, the chimpanzees and gorillas. We're going to talk in particular about two kinds of memory. One is called working memory, that is very brief, immediate, moment-to-moment memory. And we're going to talk about long-term memory and what happens from short-term and long-term memory. We're going to talk about what happens to memory as we get older. This is a large topic. And then, very briefly, what can we do to preserve our memories as we age normally? On the right is a human skull, Homo sapiens, and on the left is a chimpanzee skull. And one thing that strikes us immediately as we look at these skulls is this big bulge here, which is the frontal lobes, which have enormously developed in our species as compared to our very closest relatives with whom we share almost 100% of our DNA, which is the chimpanzee. Now, that's a little controversial as to whether the frontal lobes in our species have actually increased in size relative to the rest of the brain, but for sure they have increased in complexity and the number of things they do and the amount of control they exert over the rest of the brain. Let me give you some examples. These are our very close evolutionary kin. This is Homo erectus, who lived approximately 2 million years ago. And once again, if we look at these fellers here, we can see that the tops of their heads were smaller than this man here, who's a Greek, and they had prominent eyebrow ridges. So even though this species was even closer to us than pan-troglodytes, which is chimpanzees, they nevertheless weren't as developed as we are in terms of their frontal lobes. So our species, with its big, prominent, large, almost some would say bulging foreheads, we could be called the consummation of the frontal lobes. Now, that's not to say that that our model is perfect. By no means. I think evolution has a long way to go in terms of the development of the frontal lobes. But as far as other species, even our closest relatives, we have more frontal lobe functions than they did. And the frontal lobes, in a word, are really part of the brain's movement system. They're designed to act upon the world, but they are designed to act upon the world in a way which frees us from the world. And that is, they allow us to act in terms of our own thoughts, our own principles, our own moral behavior, our own ideas, our own wishes. They allow us to restrain ourselves from acting upon the world, restrain our impulses, to regulate our behavior. They allow us to manipulate symbols such as money, such as language, such as ideas, and they allow us to communicate those symbols from generation to generation, as we'll see in a moment. So just in the way of sheer anatomy, here they are, this big red blob in the front part of our brain, the frontal lobes here. And in fact, part of the frontal lobes, this redder blob here, is what we call the motor strip. These contain the neurons, or the nerve cells, which connect with our arms and our legs and our toes and our nose and our eyes and allow us to move them. But this part here, sometimes called the prefrontal area, it's right in front of the motor strip, is all of this behind our forehead: ideas, self-regulation, principles, behavioral restraint, and modulation. So just in the way of introduction, these are the parietal lobes here, which have a lot to do with sensation, the temporal lobes, which have a lot to do with memory and feeling, and the occipital lobes, which are primarily devoted to vision. And this here is the cerebellum, which we used to think was solely involved in movement and balance and coordination, but now we know has a huge connection with other parts of the brain. So again, just in the way of sheer anatomy, so we all know what we're talking about. The big red blob, these prefrontal areas here, are divided into real estate. And the real estate can be said to have 3 major divisions. This is the anterior means in front, cingulate. Cingulate means C-shaped. So it's a C-shaped band of tissue that runs from front to back. And this part is part of the frontal lobes here. And we're not going to talk about it further. The reason I'm telling you this is simply to show you the complexity of the organization of these areas. The orbitofrontal, here's a brain upside down. So we're looking at it from underneath. And the orbitofrontal, this green area here, is right on top of our orbits, just above our eyebrows here. It's the bottom of the frontal lobes. It's a very fascinating area. If anybody is aware of Phineas Gage, anybody hear the Phineas Gage story here? Phineas Gage was struck by that iron bar in the orbitofrontal area, which caused an enormous change in his behavior. But what we're going to talk about today is this area right here in blue, and this is called the dorsolateral part. Dorso means on the top and lateral means on the side, so right here, approximately, the dorsolateral frontal cortex, which is involved in what we call executive functions. And executive functions are, well, the analogy is if you can imagine an executive sitting at her desk. She's got a pile of paper on the left, she's got the telephone on the right, she's got her inbox on the other side, and she's saying to her secretary, please go and call so-and-so back, and I'm not going to be able to do this right now. I've got to do A, B, and C first, and then I'll get to that task. So the frontal lobes organize, orchestrate, delegate, plan, and sequence complex activities so that we can perform them in an orderly fashion. And they also hold ideas in our minds. I've said working memory, keep in mind working memory. This part of the frontal lobes allows us to hold ideas in our minds so that we can mental time travel, which is what I was doing on the way up here in the car. I was in the past, I was in the future, I was here, I was planning what I was going to say to you, and meanwhile, what was I doing? I was driving, of course. My dorsolateral frontal cortex had delegated that task to another part of my brain, which is automatic. Wasn't even thinking about it, turning on the turn signal, stepping on the brake, that kind of thing. But I was thinking. And a lot of this preparation for action, remember I said the frontal lobes are really action parts of the brain, but a lot of the preparation for action, the internal preparation, goes on thanks to this dorsolateral frontal cortex. Now, I'm going to give you an example of one of the brain functions that is very much tied to this part of the brain, and that's called working memory. Working memory, parenthesis, open parenthesis, close parenthesis. Working memory is what most people come to me complaining about when they say, Doc, I'm losing my memory. But it's really not long-term memory they're losing, it's working memory. Working memory is about the memory it takes to recall a phone number or the license plate of the guy speeding in front of you, enough to call 911 and report him. Or your parking spot, when you come back to it couple of, maybe 5 minutes later, and damn, you can't remember where it was, thanks to working memory. So let me give you an example of working memory, a working memory task, so that you can see what a short-term memory it is. Here's a typical task which is given to humans, and it's also given to monkeys, babies. It's a very simple task. And this is a visual working memory task. The person or the monkey is looking at this face for 3 seconds, and then they're looking at a blank screen for 9 seconds, and then they're shown 2 faces. So all of this takes place within 1 minute, and they're asked, which of the face did you see? Was it this one, or was it this one? Now, most of us can do this very easily, even if we close our eyes and wait 10 seconds, just like this subject would do. Why? Because we have committed that face to working memory. And we're really, really good at facial recognition. because it's very important for our survival as a species to recognize individuals, friends, foes, friendly or not. So we're all very good at faces. But what's happening in the brain? So here's working memory caught in the act. Here is a cell, 3 cells to be precise, little electrode in the dorsolateral frontal cortex of, say, the monkey, or, say, the person who has an epileptic, who's in hospital waiting to have their epileptic focus removed and they're implanted with electrodes. So we can listen into the brain. So here's this cell minding its own business, seeing the face, whole hum. Here's the waiting, and here's the face goes off, and here is a 10-second pause. And this cell, these 3 cells go bananas. These cells are hard at work, remembering that face. And then the face comes back, and these cells go on vacation again, more or less. Not really. But these cells say, okay, job's done. So what's happening? This is very cool. This is a neuron, or 3 neurons, who are very busy in the absence of a stimulus. Well, what are we doing here? We're recording thought. We're recording memory. We're recording the brain acting internally. And if we were to do this task and put this person, or you, or me, or the monkey in the MRI, the functional MRI, we would see during this task, here's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, we would see this area very active as it works, as it consumes oxygen, as these cells are busy remembering. But once the job's done, they're done, and they can go on to the next task. So working memory, as I said, is this very short-term memory that allows us to hold on to things. We can hold on to memories of faces, we can hold on to phone numbers, we can hold on to ideas. We can put ideas together in novel ways, even while we're driving and chewing gum and even carrying on a conversation. And this is probably something that other species don't do quite as well. Now, as I said, most of the time when people come to see me complaining that they're losing their memory is working memory because, let me tell you a just so story. You don't have to believe this, but I'll tell you anyway. The just so story is that because this part of our brain is a new kid on the block, evolutionarily speaking, it's kind of fragile. And that's probably true. So that anything that happens to your brain that the brain doesn't like, bad night of sleep, an argument with your wife or your husband or your teenage kid, or too much coffee or not enough coffee, a little bit too much Valium, maybe stress, anxiety, depression, the working memory part of our brain kind of shuts down. And sure enough, we can't remember stuff because working memory is the gateway into long-term memory. We have to get it in order to remember it downstream. So if working memory is offline, everything else that follows from that is often offline too. So let me tell you an anecdote. When I was green in training, I had a patient that I was following for epilepsy, and he was doing very well until he had a series of admissions, one after the other, for not taking his medications. He'd come in having a seizure, we'd fix him up, put him back on his Dilantin, out he goes, comes back again. Weeks later, until we finally twigged to something not right with this person. Why, after 20 years of being seizure-free, had he come in seizing again and again and again? What was the problem? The problem wasn't the epilepsy. The problem was working memory. He was beginning to develop a frontal lobe dementia. Working memory was failing, and he was not internally cueing himself, take your meds, take your meds. That little internal alarm clock wasn't going off. So he was literally forgetting to take his meds. So there's an example of some devastating medical issues when working memory is impaired. What else? Can't stick to a diet, can't maintain a plan, can't prepare a meal, can't follow a recipe, because you can't remember, you can't organize and sequence the steps. Now, not all of this, I have to say, is working memory. There are other functions of the executive brain that have to do with that planning as well. But working memory is very much involved in organizing a sequence of things, because you have to remember the instructions long enough to execute them and then go on to the next series of instructions. So the effects of working memory deficiency can be quite severe. Now, one of the very interesting subchapters and a subject of much research right now is asking, well, since our frontal lobes came on the block, evolutionarily speaking, relatively late, did they have anything to do with our wondrous culture? Think of that Greek head, all the artistic creation and all the skill and all the knowledge that went into carving that exquisite head. So I'm going to talk a little bit about working memory and culture, just a little perhaps anthropological digression from the brain itself. But before we do that, I'm going to give you a memory quiz. Now, I don't want you to use your paper. I just want you to listen. We're going to use our paper later, but I want you to just listen. These are the words that I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to repeat them twice, and I want you to remember them. Face, velvet, church, daisy, red. Okay, I'm going to say them again. Face, velvet, church, daisy, red. Did working memory spark creative culture? This is very new research. The idea is not that new, maybe about a decade old, but let me show you some new findings. These are the oldest stone heads known so far. They were found in a cave in South Africa called Pinnacle Point Cave, and they're approximately 70,000 years old. Now, that's our species, that's Homo sapiens. But we didn't know that Homo sapiens could produce this kind of sophisticated weapon that long ago. It was probably, by the way, much more than a weapon. Here's the cave, Pinnacle Point in South Africa. And so originally, the artifacts are just cultural objects, for example. Originally, they were found lying along the beach. And so there was a lot of excavating going on here, but then there was a heavy rainstorm, and the rain washed down a whole bunch of more, and people started looking up, and they realized that these artifacts were coming from these caves here, these limestone caves along the shoreline. And sure enough, here's the excavation in progress here. Here's the mouth of the cave here, and these archaeologists are digging, and these are called strata or layers, and each layer corresponds to a different period of geological time. So these artifacts, these stone heads, were found at one of these layers, which was dated at approximately 70,000 years, 71,000 years ago, pretty precisely. So, well, what does that have to do with working memory? Well, here's how this story goes. They're hard to make. They're complex little stone heads. By the way, they're very small. They're really just approximately an inch or so long. But the technology had to be quite sophisticated to produce them. First of all, you had to get just the right kind of sand, and you had to heat it to just the right temperature so that it would melt, and you had to figure out how to make a fire that hot and how to keep it that hot, how to melt them, and then how to shape them. Remember, we're talking about sequencing, planning, multi-step procedures here, and you had to remember how to do that too. And then you had to glue them onto pieces of wood. These are replicas here showing how these artifacts were probably used. And by the way, they were flung, okay? They were flung at wild beasts and to kill them, and very likely flung at other members of our species and probably other species as well. We won't go into aggression. That's another topic. But this is high technology in the Stone Age. So, as I said, you had to find the sand, and it had to be the right kind of sand. You had to gather the wood. You had to transport the wood. It might have come from a distance. You had to get it there, which, as you can imagine, I don't think they had wheels at that time. It was quite an endeavor. You had to get the temperature just right. You had to shape the blades with other pieces of stone. You had to mount them. So this was, as I said, high technology. And excavations have suggested that this type of so-called projectile technology was quite widespread. We're finding it now not only at Pinnacle Point, but in areas around Pinnacle Point, and it appears to have gone on for thousands of years. So clearly it was a successful technology, and the fact that it went on for thousands of years means what? What inference can we draw? It was transmitted. That's right, it was passed on. In other words, it was collectively remembered and transmitted. This is cultural transmission, and certainly it was oral transmission, so they had to remember those steps. And of course, there was all kinds of other things going on. There were all parasites, there was rotting teeth, there was famine, possibly, temperature fluctuations, incursions by neighboring competitors, and all kinds of the exigencies of survival at the time. By the way, these were probably not just used for throwing. These were probably used for all kinds of things. There's even some evidence that they might have been used as ornaments and jewelry, as signs of wealth. They were used for scraping things, just like we would use like a food scraper right now, scraping plates or scraping probably animal hides, shaping things, digging. So they were very, very useful objects, which accounts for the fact that they were transmitted and used. And by the way, another thing I wanted to point out to you was that throwing something at something else is an example of frontal lobe function. It's not a sheer motor activity. There's a heck of a lot of planning in aiming, knowing where the beast is going to be, probably cooperative hunting, which involves sophisticated exchange of information. But remember what I said in the very beginning, our frontal lobes allow us to act on the world independent of the stimulus. So you plan, where is that beast going to be in 5 seconds, and then you act. So that is a beautiful example of being able to distance yourself from the immediate and plan for the future. Just as I said, attack from a safe distance. These are people in Papua New Guinea who continue to use stone axes today, probably not for very long because we are gradually marching in upon them and their indigenous culture won't last very long. But these men have erected a very complex scaffolding to get up to this rock face, mine the sand. They actually light a fire under it and heat it so that the rock cracks, and then they chip it out, and then they take it back. And we don't know, of course, but we surmise that possibly very similar planning and cooperation existed at the time, 70,000 years ago. There's another chapter that I won't go into now as well, and that is the idea that perhaps using this kind of technology evolved at the same time as our very complex social skills. You can't do this alone. You have to do this in a group. And you have to get along with other members of the group, and you have to cooperate with them, and you have to know who's your friend and who's not your friend. That's a whole fascinating chapter in social cognition, and perhaps we'll have another talk on that at some point. So, executive function. Here's a definition that I like, and we'll quote: the ability to hold and manipulate operations and images of objects in memory, and to execute goal-directed procedures over space and time. Thank you, dorsolateral frontal cortex. Now, I want you to get out your paper and your pens or pencils and write down as many of the words as you can. Don't ask your neighbor, just write them down. Okay. Now, without embarrassing anybody, I'm going to give you some clues. If anybody didn't get all 5 of those words, not to worry. The first word was a part of our body. The second word was a type of cloth or a type of fabric. The third word was a special kind of building or a special kind of place. The fourth word was a kind of flower. And the fifth word was a color. Okay? So what I've done, if anybody has noticed that those cues, those are called category cues, helped you recall any of those words. If we had you in the functional MRI scanner, what we would see was your frontal lobes saying, that's right. I knew that word. I just couldn't retrieve it. I knew it. And that brings me to the next chapter here, which is what do the frontal lobes do in long-term memory? This task that we just did together, these 5 words, even though the interval between my giving them to you and retrieving them was quite short, we call this long-term memory, as opposed to this working memory, which is ultra-short-term. Working memory held it in your mind long enough to get it into long-term memory, and then the frontal lobes helped fish it out. So let's talk a little bit about the frontal lobes and long-term memory. So there's 3 steps. First of all, you got to get it in, and that is very much a function of the frontal lobes. If you had not been looking at me, paying attention, and listening, you wouldn't have remembered downstream. So you got to get it in, and I plugging it in. I have to thank one of my patients for that. I was trying to explain to him, what do we mean by this function of working memory, or the first step in memory, and he put his finger on it. Plug it in. The second step is write it down, and that is really putting it into your brain. Etch the stone tablets. Get those words in there. And that depends on this structure here in the temporal lobes called the hippocampus. Hippocampus means seahorse. Here it is, because it looks very much like a little seahorse. And the hippocampus does not keep those words itself. It helps the brain, it dispatches those words to other parts of the brain where they are encoded, remembered. It writes it elsewhere in the brain. But the hippocampus seems to be necessary for that kind of getting it in and sticking it in. And then you have to get it back, which is what we just did. Now, as you can see, this 3-part sequence in memory is plug it in, frontal lobes, attention, write it down, hippocampus or temporal lobes, get it out, retrieve it, frontal lobes again. So we've got 2 out of 3 is frontal lobes. And as I said a moment ago, if your frontal lobes are offline for whatever reason, the big 5 reasons being anxiety, depression, bad sleep, chronic pain, and medication side effects, those are ones I see over and over again, frontal lobes are offline, can't remember, because you either can't get it in or you can't retrieve it. And what we see is that with a little cueing, it was a flower, it was a color. Oh, yes, I knew that. Just couldn't get it out. Now, I'm going to give you another frontal lobe task. And this has to do with retrieval, what we were just talking about, getting it out, retrieving something that you already know from long-term storage. This is going to take exactly a minute, and if you can, with a piece of paper, pair up with the person next to you, because this requires somebody doing the task and somebody recording it. So if you can just make arrangements with the person sitting next to you, I'm going to tell you what I'd like you to do in just a minute. Okay, here's the instructions. For anybody who isn't working with a partner, just use your own piece of paper and just write. Okay, so the instructions are that I'm going to give you about exactly a minute to name as many words as you can that begin with the letter F, F like Frank. Don't start till I say. No names, no proper names, no places. No numbers. I don't want 51, 52, 53. Okay, doesn't count. Okay, so when I say go, so one person will do the task and one will record. Okay, go. Okay, stop. No cheating. How many people found this test difficult? I do. How many people used strategies such as looking around the room or remembering a dictionary? Or using related terms? How many people use strategies to do this, like looking around the room for cues, dictionary, thinking of words in the same class? Frontal lobes, very good, very good, very good strategy. It's real hard. I myself find it very hard. The norm is approximately 15, anywhere from 10 to 20. And as we get older, it goes down normally. An older person above 60 should have at least 10. So, folks, what you have just experienced is two of the very tasks that I use as a behavioral neurologist with my patients who come in. And one of the very important things that I'm able to say to a lot of people, if they have trouble remembering those 5 words, but get them back with cues, then it says to me that it's less likely that we're dealing with Alzheimer's disease, because in Alzheimer's disease, it's the hippocampus which is first and foremost affected. They can remember it short term, but they cannot write it down. They can't engrave it in the brain. So the cues don't help. They're just not there. And the other thing that we've just done is this so-called verbal fluency task, which is a very famous cognitive task, which way activates the frontal lobe, particularly on the left, because this is a language task. And the neuropsychologists call this accessing the verbal lexicon. You have to get at the knowledge you know. And this is a search and retrieval mission. What is it called in law? Search and retrieve or search and rescue? Search and rescue. And this is, again, a very, very frontal lobe task. So you've just experienced 2 of the very, very standard frontal lobe tasks. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit. Talk to you about memory and the aging brain. Memory does decline with age. And the Harvard Health Letter, if anybody is interested here, has a nice little summary of the types of forgetfulness that happen with age. I'm going to run through them fairly quickly with you. One of them is transience. We just forget stuff faster. We don't know exactly why, but the memory trace is simply not as enduring. So maybe it's a good thing. I mean, we kind of clear out the brain, and we just can't hold as much information in our brains as we used to be able to. Another one is absent-mindedness, and really this is frontal lobes. This is frontal lobes going offline, and I certainly find it in myself. And a typical example is going into a room and forgetting what you've gone to do all the time. This didn't used to happen to me in my 20s and 30s, but I'm certainly aware of it, and this is working memory, and this is very common. Another example of this is somebody not being able to recall a familiar name, just like you did a moment ago. Can't get it out, can't retrieve it. Losing stuff around the house, can't remember where you put it down. Forgetting your pills, forgetting appointments. Blocking, I guess I just said that. Again, this is the left dorsolateral frontal cortex. Can't get that, shine that flashlight on stuff we know. But very, very often the stuff is there. As you can see, if you give the person a cue, the name started with S, or the appointment was up the hill, the memory's there. It's a little sluggish to retrieve the memory that is already there. Misattribution. This happens to me, unfortunately, when my husband takes credit for stuff that I think of, and he gets all the credit. So, we sometimes see cases of plagiarism, and the scientist says, I didn't plagiarize that at all, or the songwriter says, my goodness, this was my idea. It really is a failure to categorize what originates from inside and what originates from somewhere else. The frontal lobes help put memories in boxes. They store them in different contexts, and those contexts can become a little fuzzy over time. Suggestibility is another one. And let me talk a little bit about suggestibility. I have many patients, very often folks with trauma or others, who say, I have a literal memory. I can remember exactly what happened to me. A, B, C, D. I have a super memory, and it's just like that. Well, in fact, it's not. And there are many studies now suggesting that we are highly suggestible, and that memories can be implanted in us, and we will believe them and swear that we are remembering them, even if somebody has put them in our brain. And let me give you an example which is very timely. There was a study done of college students who were asked what they were doing at the time of the Challenger disaster. And then their responses were recorded. Then they were asked again a year later. Then they were asked again 2 years later and 3 years later. And every time they were asked, they were asked, how certain are you of your memory? What was found was that the memories did change. What were you doing at the time? Well, I was in the kitchen washing the dishes, or, oh, I was watching TV with my boyfriend. How certain are you? Sure. But in fact, the response might have been different a year earlier. So memories do slip and slide. And with this Boston Marathon and with the 9/11 disaster, for example, we may all remember or think we remember exactly what we were doing at the time, and we may be absolutely certain of it. Every time our frontal lobe retrieves a memory, that's oversimplifying. Every time our frontal lobe and our hippocampus cooperate to retrieve a memory, it gets tweaked a little bit. We take it out, unfold it, brush off the dust, hang it up, put it away again, and then the brain elaborates, puts it in a different box, puts it in a different category, relates it to different circumstances, adds on a little touch. We take it out again a year later, and the memory has morphed a little bit. Now, this is not true of everybody, but this is a well-known and well-studied phenomenon. So if you ask your kids, remember yourselves, what did you do when you heard about yesterday's tragedy? A year later, some of us will have a different memory of what we were doing at the time. This gets, again, into a very, very difficult and complex topic of ethics and morals. The ethical aspects of these are, well, how legitimate is it to implant a false memory into somebody? But in fact, studies do show that this can occur. I'm sorry about the encumbered slide. I just wanted to read you this history here. So college students were implanted, as it were, or reminded of a false event. They were told they had spent a hospitalization overnight for a high fever, they had an ear infection, or they were at a birthday party with pizza and a clown. And then they were asked right away again, and some of them said, no way. And then they were asked a couple of weeks later, and then 20% said they thought they could remember something about it. And then they were asked another few weeks later, and the percentage who remembered rose, who remembered the false memory went up, especially if their friends or their parents or people in authority said, don't you remember that? Don't you remember we were there and we were holding hands and blah, blah, blah. There was social pressure, in other words. And the kids then began to remember, and they would elaborate. So memory is as flexible and as malleable as our brain function is. It's a plastic phenomenon. So I was talking about what happens to memory as we get older. Suggestibility, by the way, is a phenomenon that can happen throughout life. Bias is another change, and that is that our memories are filtered by what we expect, the way we perceive it. And this is a story about a reporter who remembered seeing that plane hitting the World Trade Center on September 11th, but in fact, that TV footage was only aired one day later. That surprised me too, because I thought I'd seen it the same day. It wasn't. So again, our memories kind of kaleidoscope, collapse these things. How many, by the way, of you remembered seeing the plane hitting the building, seeing TV footage of the plane hitting the building the first day? I thought so. Yeah, at least half. Congratulations to those who did not raise their hands. And then there's this converse phenomenon, which is persistence, and that is stuff you cannot get out of your memory. And we see this in trauma survivors, and we see it often in older people who are often plagued by certain memories of their past, very often that they can't forget. This is the opposite of forgetting. Let me talk to you just a touch about post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD, in many ways, is a disorder of memory. And this is an example of the persistence of memories that people cannot get out of their minds. They have flashbacks. They have vivid nightmares. Or they may be driving under a bridge and have a vivid flashback of a IED being thrown off a bridge, for example. Or they may go into a restaurant and insist on sitting facing the door because they have a vivid memory of the door opening, etc., etc. So PTSD is very much a disorder of memory in which the hippocampus, that little seahorse-type organ in our temporal lobes, keeps flashing parts of the memory back at us. But there's another aspect to PTSD, and I'll say it quite in summary. And the other aspect to PTSD is that normally the frontal lobes turn down these negative memories, these experiences, so that they don't intrude on our awareness. But in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, they don't. The frontal lobes are not doing their job. So the negative parts of us, the parts which are totally overwhelmed and terrorized and panic-stricken and threatened, hold sway. And the frontal lobes aren't able to say, shh, it's okay, you're living in the 20th or 21st century. It's okay, you're not in Afghanistan. Okay, you're not a rape victim now, you're married, that kind of thing. So that if we put folks with post-traumatic stress disorder in the functional magnetic imaging, we can see that this red part, these red parts of the brain that light up, this is the hippocampus and amygdala here, which is right next to it. These are the memory centers of our brain, emotion, highly linked to emotion. But at the same time, we can see that while these structures are way active, remembering, the frontal lobes, in blue here, are less active. They're not gating this memory. They're not shutting it down. They're not regulating the volume. So PTSD is like a seesaw that's been tipped so that instead of a normal balance between feeling and reasoning, we have feeling, in this case negative feeling, way high and reasoning way down. So there's an example of the frontal lobes in post-traumatic stress disorder. And as I said, as we get older, normally our frontal lobes are less efficient. And I saw in my grandmother, who was a trauma survivor, that those memories became much more frequent and unpleasant for her. So we're talking about memory as we get older. Once again, this is just the same thing that I showed you. Frontal lobes offline. Here's this anterior cingulate here, here's the orbitofrontal cortex, and here's the hippocampus here, remembering hard. So let me end here, or coast toward the end, by giving you some very brief, share some very brief information with you on what we can do to age well. How can we preserve this critical function? Well, let me tell you the bottom line, because I really would very much like to have some time with you to ask and answer questions. I'll tell you the bottom line here. Mental activity, physical activity, both. It grows brain cells. It grows what are called neurohormones or growth factors that preserve brain cells. It grows blood vessels. It grows connections between brain cells. Crossword puzzles, brain teasers, social stimulation, outings, reading, listening to the radio, playing cards, and physical activity. I'm going to skip the evidence here, which you can read. These are so-called neuroprotective. It preserves our brain and its cognitive functions. So you can reduce those normal incursions of age on memory. As I said, you can grow new blood vessels. And here is a picture of baby nerve cells, these guys here, nerve cell babies in the hippocampus. This was a recent discovery. I don't know how old it was. Is Dr. Forehand here? I'm not sure. Probably within the last decade, showing that although we didn't used to think that our brains could grow new nerve cells, in fact they can. And the more we use our brain, the more we ask of our brain, and the more we ask of our body physically, the more those new nerve cells grow and sprout and form connections and preserve our capacity to memorize, to have memories and to think well. So get on your wheel, get on your roto reel, give yourself mental challenge, and I really should include social challenges here too, because we're social animals and we do need the social stimulation. Very important for elderly especially, who are sitting alone and inactive in nursing homes and in their apartments. Very important to get out and talk, interact, and move. Now this does not count. Now, I did add one final slide, and I want to see if I can show this to you. And this is today, because it is just so cool. This is not in your notes, not in your handouts. The persons who invented this are probably going to win the Nobel Prize. I think this is probably one of those astounding discoveries. You may have seen this on YouTube or may have seen it on the news. I'm going to show you a video. This is Dr. Kurt Deseroth and his colleague, Dr. Chung, at Stanford University, who have figured out a beautiful way to actually look at the brain in 3 dimensions. Let me see if I can get out of here and show you the video. I'm just going to stop that because we should have sound on. Is our sound plugged in? I don't know if the sound is on in the room. Are the AV people here?
Jim's coming, but
He's
he's
coming.
just training.
Oh, I see.
Video isn't up there either. It's not up. Right.
Okay, I will in a moment. I hope so.
Laptop, maybe. I don't know if there's volume adjustment. No. Sure.
Why wouldn't it be up there?
Here, because here.
Oh,
It's
it's
that
just-
does it. I don't know if that'll help or not.
No, we're getting this.
How come I'm not connected to the net? That's my PowerPoint. Why did I
No,
lose
yeah, you-
connectivity? I'll
Okay.
let you put me back.
Okay, it's back. I took it off again, so it should be back to where it was. Now it's not.
Oh. Yeah, okay. And this
I
is,
had my PowerPoint up here until just a moment ago.
Yeah, well, when you
Recognize
said I'm going to
screen?
get out of this,
Detect
yeah,
monitor?
that's the PowerPoint thing.
well, I think,
This one?
we want to go back to show here. Let's go to slideshow.
Slideshow. Here you go. You're back up.
Okay, but I wanted to show the YouTube video. We talked about showing the YouTube video. Can we?
There it goes. Now it's
Oh, good.
fine.
Okay.
We're heading into the center of a mouse's brain, into the hippocampus where memories are formed. Looking up, you can see neurons projecting to the surface of the brain. This is the work of Carl Diceroth and his team at Stanford University. By making the entire brain transparent, they were able to image it using a light microscope. They call the new technique clarity. Existing techniques for studying the brain's wiring are often limited to looking at very small volumes of brain, or they don't allow you to label genes or chemicals of interest. The advantage of clarity is that you can label lots of molecules in whole brains. So how do you make a brain transparent? The thing that obscures the view is fat. Lipid layers surround each cell. To remove them without disrupting the cell structure, the team used a hydrogel to create a mesh to hold the rest of the components in place. Then they could clear away the fat. This is a mouse brain before and after. The brain is now transparent to light, but it's also permeable to molecules, which means scientists can add molecular markers to highlight specific features. In this 1 millimeter block of hippocampus, excitatory neurons are green, inhibitory neurons are red, and cells called astrocytes are blue. The technique works in human brains too. This is a chunk of the frontal lobe of a 7-year-old boy who had autism. It's possible to trace the path of a single nerve projection through a forest of other cells. When the team looked closely in one layer of the cortex, they noticed ladder-like patterns where neurons had connected back to themselves and to other neurons. Similar abnormal structures have been seen in animals with autism-like behaviors. Being able to analyze brain structures like this and match them up with molecular information could help neuroscientists uncover how changes to the brain underlie disease. And it's not just the brain. The researchers say the technique could be applied to any organ.
In there, I just wanted to let you know that this is right now on the horizon. This is breaking news, and I'm sure that in another decade we'll have much more to say about the frontal lobes and the hippocampus. So I'll be very happy to have some questions and an exchange. Yes, sir. It is. Transparent brain, probably. Yes, sir.
We're talking about persistence and then talked about PTSD.
Yes.
Traumatic. But how does one forget knowledge? How can you forget knowledge that is no longer of use to you? Like I know how to operate a phone system at work that we got rid of 20 years ago. Is that still rattling around, taking up space? How does one hurt himself with that, or does it disappear?
The question is, how can we forget trivia? That really is an affliction, isn't it? Yes. Well, yes.
Is the memory taken up by these things that prevent you from, as you age, remembering things you do need to remember?
In other words, does trivia crowd other memories? It does. It does, yes. There is a constant process of revision and sweeping away of these old memories. I remember I was talking about transience, but it happens more in some people than others. And I don't know the answer to what we can do to get rid of it. I would imagine that there are probably some cognitive exercises in shutting down the non-useful memories. Because one thing that I thought about showing you but didn't show you was that the frontal lobes can actually suppress memories. We kind of hinted at it in post-traumatic stress disorder. But for example, if I gave you those 5 words again and I said, forget them, we put you in the scan, you'd be good at forgetting them. You probably would have poorer recall, especially for a college student, they'd be given $5 for every word they forgot. There's a motivational incentive to forget. The frontal lobes are active in shutting down memories as well. So I imagine that probably there could be some training to forget trivia, intrusive trivia. Good question. There was a question over here somewhere. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question.
Yes.
I wonder how the brain is responding to the overstimulation as part of our current culture.
The question is, how does our brain respond to the overstimulation which is part of our culture? That is a complex question. A lot of what the brain does, curiously enough, is actually shut out information. And an example of that right now is that you wonderful audience are sitting here and you're not paying attention to what's going on in the hallway, or in your bladders, maybe, but generally, or in your stomachs if you're hungry. Your brain really is regulating your attention to a great extent. And for a child with attention deficit disorder, something trivial like a plane overhead or the sink dripping is an extraordinary intrusion. So shutting out stuff is a normal function of our brain. And in post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, one of the therapeutic techniques is to teach people how to do that. Did I answer your question? Partially.
I may not have expressed it clearly enough. And that is, I'm thinking of cell phones and computers and TV and noise. And
yes.
things like that.
Cell phones, computers, TV, ambient noise. Yes. Yes. The fact is they do intrude. These things do intrude, and they do impair us, and they do tax our attentional capacities to shut them out. And there have been studies, for example, of the effect of noise level on people's cognitive functioning, and indeed, it does. Now, there's a whole range of susceptibility in the general population. Some people are very susceptible, and some people are not at all susceptible. But yes, the answer is that these things do intrude, and they take up cognitive processing in order to shut them out, so that we are less efficient when there's a lot of clamor for our attention.
So in the long term, might that change the way that we age, or that our brains respond to age because they've been stimulated so much?
The question is, would our brains age differently because we've been exposed to so much stimulation coming at us? I don't know the answer to that question. A different aspect of the question is, are our children who are constantly exposed, bombarded with information, television, and rapid switching of subjects from one show to another, for example, in the blink of an eye, how will that affect them? I have to tell you that as a lecturer, giving lectures, I am very much aware of that, and I try to pace it very quickly because I know that young people are used to a certain level of stimulation, and if they don't get it, their minds will wander. So I don't know if anybody's studying that. I'm sure some people are, and I suspect the answer is not good. I'm sorry, now I'm going to skip you because you already asked it. Did you ask or did I? There's no looking at it. Yeah, let me just go on for a sec. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes. Can you tell us if neuroimaging has been able to demonstrate any neuroanatomical differences in intrusive thought disorders like PTSD and obsessive-compulsive disorder?
Oh, yes. the question is whether neuroimaging shows differences in the brain in PTSD and OCD. Oh, very much so. There's a very interesting literature and a complex literature. Post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, the hippocampus, which I talked a little bit about, and its neighbor, the amygdala, which is our brain's threat detector, they light up if they're exposed to anything that reminds you of the trauma. For example, hearing a certain noise, smelling a certain smell, seeing something. Those structures are extremely active, but at the same time, they're smaller. They shrink. And their connections with the frontal lobes are not that good in terms of what we call connectivity. So the frontal lobes can't really shush them down very much because they're not talking well to each other. So there's a very interesting literature on that, and OCD has its own set of neuroimaging abnormalities as well. I won't go into it because it's another subject, but yes, indeed. But we're just getting there. And I think that the transparent brain that you saw just now is going to tell us a heck of a lot about, even in more detail, what's going on in OCD, PTSD, and all these neuropsychiatric disorders, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, for example. Let's have you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for acknowledging me. I'm very, very interested in the nervous breakdowns that I've heard about in the last 20 years. I've known one person in particular, and that person had shock therapy. I want to know what part of the brain is affected by a nervous breakdown, what actually happens, and why shock therapy? And are the brain cells damaged once you have shock therapy?
So the question is, what's happening in the brain if you have a nervous breakdown, and what happens if you have ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy? First of all, as far as ECT, I can't tell you a lot because I don't know a lot about what happens specifically in the brain. I'm not sure we understand it very well. As far as nervous breakdown, that's a kind of a popular term for many different things. Generally, it refers to anxiety, depression, very poor sleep. Maybe there's pain associated with that. But people in the throes of what we call a nervous breakdown really cannot function. And I see these folks, and a very prominent complaint is that they have no memory. They're often afraid of getting Alzheimer's. But in the most general terms, a nervous breakdown in terms of brain function very much impairs what we call attention. That's that first step in memory, what my patient called plugging it in. And so they cannot pay attention to things, even trivial things like preparing a meal, doing a routine job, going out shopping, because of those executive functions that plan, sequence, organize, delegate, relegate, defer, and regulate emotion as well. So the brain is the frontal lobe's overwhelmed by this negative feeling. And there are indeed very real impairments of attention and downstream effects on memory. That's a simple answer to a large question. As far as ECT, I would defer that because I don't really know what happens in the brain as far as imaging or even at the level of individual cells. Good question. Let's alternate side to side. Yes, ma'am. Can you talk up just a touch?
You talked about changes in the frontal lobe related to PTSD and OCD. Were those changes there before in the case of trauma, for instance? Were they there before the trauma, or was that person particularly prone to PTSD as opposed to another individual who would have the same experience?
The question was, is PTSD something that can happen to anybody, or are there certain brains that are more susceptible to PTSD? Is that your question? That's a hot area of research right now. And the Army, the military, is investing greatly in trying to answer that question because it's very important to identify what soldiers are vulnerable. Many soldiers are exposed, and some of them are extremely resilient and don't get PTSD even if they are exposed to highly traumatic events. So it's a very important area to try to find out. And it's very controversial. Some people claim that the hippocampus and amygdala may be smaller in those individuals. They may have less what's called cognitive control. In other words, the frontal lobes may not be able to regulate their emotions as well. Certainly genetics probably plays a role. Like any other biological phenomenon, there's probably a variability of vulnerability. Vulnerability may vary in the population, and it may depend both on the individual as well as on the type, nature, and extent of trauma. I suspect that's going to be the answer, but we don't have a clear answer at this point. Let's switch side to side. Ma'am, yes?
Do you think that nutrients or vitamin supplements help restore brain cells or keep the brain healthy?
That's a very good question about nutraceuticals, basically. Nutraceutical, are you familiar with the term nutraceuticals as opposed to pharmaceuticals? I very much think so. But don't ask me for evidence, because we have very little evidence. We have many, many claims and very little hard evidence. As a physician, what I often tell my patients is, first, do no harm. That is a principle we all swear to when we graduate, of course, part of our training. So if they ask me about fish oil, coconut oil, broccoli, all the things we hate to eat and it's supposed to be good for you, I say, sure. We don't have good evidence yet. And in fact, there hasn't been a lot of money put into that kind of research because the money from pharma is going into drugs, unfortunately. So we don't know for sure, but there are a number of things, including fish oil, exercise, for example, cognitive activity, balanced diet, that we know, that we suspect are very good for the brain. And I always leave my patients free to pursue that if they choose to. There are some claims for something called something milk. I don't know. You probably know more than I do. Don't believe everything you read, because the evidence is very, very scant for...
On television last night I was watching, and the doctor, I can't remember, Dr. Arnold something, was promoting something, it starts with P. He didn't write it down.
Many claims, and many claims in the non-conventional literature as well, which are not backed by solid scientific evidence. But that doesn't mean it's not valid. It just means we don't yet have the evidence. Yes, sir. Ma'am, I'm sorry. Yes, yes.
I have an adopted child, and she was in an orphanage for many years of her life at the beginning of her life, and they said that a lot of parts of her brain are actually damaged. Does the frontal lobe grow new brain cells so then the person can start remembering and start doing work that they missed?
The question was about this adopted child who was in an orphanage for the first few years? 4 years. Was your child neglected or abused in the orphanage, or neglected, like the Romanian orphans, for example? Yes, yes, right. There is absolute, unequivocal evidence that childhood neglect and adversity can permanently alter brain function and even structure. Generally, the brains are smaller, and particularly in certain areas, frontal lobes is one of them, corpus callosum, cerebellum, hippocampus, amygdala. They may have learning deficits, behavioral deficits. There are two answers to your question. One is the concept of a developmental window. and that is that the brains are very, very flexible, but you have to imprint the brain with the proper stimulation at the proper time. Once that window closes, it's very hard. And we all have the experience of learning a language when we're 3 as opposed to when we're 63. The developmental window for language learning closes early, and it becomes harder to learn. Having said that, the other part of the coin is that our brains are so plastic. We're learning all the time, and with the proper environment and with a resilient child, you can offset the adversity to a great extent. I don't know how much more time we have. Do we have time for continued questions? Yes? Let's continue. Yes.
I had a question about if you have any resources for strategies for improving rote memory. I work as a literacy tutor and I help people memorize multiplication facts and, rote information.
The question is about strategies for improving rote memory, and the answer is no, I don't. Thank you, though. There are a number of brain training resources online, but I usually just refer my patients to them, or I refer them elsewhere for the actual therapy. Let's switch sides here. Yes, sir.
Do you have a brief explanation, anatomically or physiologically, for what explains why some individuals have sharper memory and some individuals just don't have a sharp memory?
The question is why some individuals have a very sharp memory and some don't. One obvious answer is that the individuals who have a sharp memory are usually younger. But even within the same age group, I understand what you're getting at, yes. No, I don't. There's a lot of research now, and there will be much more on what is the substrate for that. What do people's brains look like who do have good memories as opposed to not? Like any other trait, it's a widely variable in the population, just like height. But I don't know specifically at the molecular level. Are there more neurons in the hippocampus? Are there better connections between the hippocampus and frontal lobes? Does the hippocampus grow new neurons more readily, for example? Is there more growth factor, neuronal growth factor in those brains? I don't know. Those are all possible, but I just don't know the specific answer. Very good question. Let's switch. Yes?
I understand, I ask, has any studies been done about the effects of meditation? And I understand affects the size of the hippocampus when it's studied.
The question is on the effects of meditation on...
My understanding is that it affects the size or enlarges the size of the hippocampus when it's studied.
The question is whether meditation can enlarge the hippocampus. I don't know. I do know that there is a very interesting study going on right now at Norwich University, where my husband teaches, and the cadets, all of them, are being taught transcendental meditation as a way to float, levitate. No, excuse me, I just couldn't. No, they're being taught TM as a way to instill resilience in case they're exposed to trauma, for example. So there's good evidence that it does increase resilience. Are you aware of TM or other meditative techniques enlarging the hippocampus?
I understand there was some MRIs done on the meditative people who meditate fairly intensely. It's enlarged the size. Very interesting. For a short period of time.
For a short period of time. In a short period of time. I wouldn't be surprised because it does. There are certainly absolute cognitive, behavioral, and even EEG changes. I wouldn't be surprised, but thank you. That's a very interesting point. Okay, yes.
In terms of the history of the science and the arts of memory, before we came up with the term working memory or short-term memory, so we just call it study or learning?
I think we probably call that attention. Working memory is just a kind of attention, focus, so that you can actually, what shall I say, encode the information? Yeah, yes. Working memory is a fairly recent term. I don't know who's responsible for that term. But it does come under the big A, the attentional umbrella, which is that vulnerable function. Let's take you in the back there.
It doesn't explain, though, why some of our memories are long-term that we didn't pay attention to.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, you remember a scene from childhood for some strange reason of a slice of memory that flashes back. You remember the day, it was an afternoon, you remember maybe it's a smell, you remember the smell of milk in the lunchroom. You didn't pay attention to that. You didn't cycle it in your short term, and yet there it is. Stuck
Yes, very interesting. Look, yes, let me just repeat that. We have sometimes unbidden memories. I think maybe the psychoanalysts might call them screen memories, as if they're whole parts of our past that we didn't really think we were paying attention to.
Call it quintuplet or something. If you qualify fire at once, and it's like, whoa!
Yes, right. We do. That's an interesting point, and I would imagine that since the brains of young children are so absorbent, so plastic, they are absorbing. Don't forget, however, that they're also reconstructing. And these memories that pop into our minds are, especially the very remote ones, there's a very high chance that those are reconstructed memories. That's not to say that they're less vivid for us or less meaningful, but I wouldn't assume that those are necessarily the way it was.
When you drive by the middle school and look, it looks the exact same way.
Same old. Yes. Smells and all. No questions on this side? Yes.
You talk about how memories morph. And so do memories sometimes, they just get buried for the sake of protection of one's being, psychic being? I mean, where does the psychic self and the brain function come together to protect you from having to face things? Sort of like the contrary of PTSD? I don't know if it is a contrary.
You know, studies, I'm not an expert on PTSD, but studies of trauma victims suggest that playing and replaying traumatic memories is not necessarily such a good thing. That people who are good at suppressing traumatic memories are often those who can survive and go beyond. And so there is this constant sort of ferment going on in the brain, as we all do every day, in terms of popping up of middle school memories, for example, pushing them down again, and other things coming up, and then memories getting cleared out for new material. This is a kind of constant convection current that goes on in the brain. And it's highly adaptive because our brains do have to be open to new experiences all the time. You asked another question which was buried in there, and that is the interface between what I've told you about brain function and the self, or the psychic self. I can't even go there. I can't even begin to go there. I would love to go there, but that'll be another lecture.
Okay, but the brain kind of has to change the memory to let it rest, so to speak.
The brain does change the memory all the time. As I said, it takes it out, dusts it off, and puts it away again. And every time that happens, there is a little change. Not necessarily a change in the memory, but a change in the synaptic machinery that keeps that memory in our brain. And that's those synapses are constantly, those proteins are constantly being turned over. All protein, that's right. And fat. You gentlemen, sir, you had a question a moment ago, but
one last question.
Okay, we have one last question here.
By the question that the lady over there asked about whether the pervasive increase in drug use, particularly in the state of Vermont, is that related to overstimulation? And maybe that's an attempt by the brain to reach some sort of homeostasis, some sort of a calming period?
The question is about whether the pervasive increase in drug use in this state, everywhere, is related to overstimulation. You know, there's so many facets to that question. What I would say right away is that is there any relationship at all, or are they simply co-occurring but unrelated? I think that would probably take a very large scale to sort out, because there's so many different variables including the demographics, the use of cell phones, the access to money, for example, or lack of access to money. That's the starting point, not the answer. I think we probably need to stop, and I want to thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.